Blood on white Italian marble. That was the price of loyalty in Chicago's underground. When the bullets started flying at the Russo estate, the boss's glamorous wife packed her diamonds and ran, leaving her newborn twins to the wolves. But she didn't count on Gabriel. A quiet girl making barely minimum wage to scrub floors did what a mother wouldn't. She stood between a rival family's guns and two sleeping babies. Now, the blood has dried, the enemies are buried, and Gabriel is trapped in a breathtaking gilded cage. Because Griffin Russo owes her his sons' lives, and a ruthless man like him never lets his saviors go, the Russo estate in Lake Forest was supposed to be a fortress. Gabriel Hayes knew this because she spent 60 hours a week polishing its bulletproof windows and scrubbing the imported stone floors until her knuckles bled. She was a ghost in a house of shadows, paid to keep her head down, ignore the heavily armed men at the perimeter, and never ask questions about Griffin Russo's import-export business. It was 2 a.m. on a Tuesday when the illusion of safety shattered. Gabriel was in the ground-floor laundry room, treating a wine stain on one of Sylvia Russo's silk evening gowns. The first sound wasn't an explosion, but a sickening, muffled thud, the sound of a suppressed weapon taking down the guard at the South Terrace. Then came the chaotic symphony of breaking glass, shouting in rapid Italian, and the heavy synchronized boots of an assault team breaching the manor. Panic seized Gabriel's throat. The Moretti family. It had to be. Whispers in the kitchen had been tense for weeks regarding a territorial dispute over the docks. Gabriel dropped the silk gown and backed into the shadows of the utility closet. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Through the crack in the door, she saw 3 men dressed in tactical black sweep through the hallway, assault rifles raised. Above her, on the second floor, a woman's frantic footsteps clicked rapidly across the hardwood. It was Sylvia. Gabriel recognized the distinct sound of the boss's wife's designer heels. She heard the heavy oak door of the master suite slam, followed by the whirring gears of the private emergency elevator that led directly to the underground garage. She's running, Gabriel realized with a jolt. She's taking the emergency exit. But the nursery was on the 3rd floor. A chilling silence followed Sylvia's escape. Griffin was in New York on business. Arturo, his right-hand man, was downtown. The twins, Matteo and Leo, barely 3 months old, were upstairs. Gabriel squeezed her eyes shut, silently begging for someone, anyone, to go up there. But the gunfire downstairs was intensifying. The remaining estate guards were pinned in the foyer. The intruders were fanning out, systematically searching the rooms. They weren't just here to send a message. They were here to eradicate the Russo bloodline. It's not my job. I'm just a maid, Gabriel thought, tears pricking her eyes. If I move, I die. But in the quiet that followed a deafening shotgun blast, she heard it. A faint, distressed wail drifting down the grand staircase. Matteo. He always cried when he was woken up suddenly. A curse slipped from Gabriel's lips. She kicked off her sensible black work shoes, knowing they would scuff and make noise. In her stocking feet, she slipped out of the laundry room and darted toward the back servant stairs. The narrow, spiraling staircase was dark, smelling of lemon polish and old wood. She took the steps 2 at a time, her lungs burning, praying she wouldn't encounter a man in black. When she reached the 3rd floor, the nursery door was ajar. The soft, ambient light of the starry night projector spun lazily across the ceiling, casting blue and green nebulas over the luxurious room. Matteo was crying in his crib, while Leo slept soundly beside him. Shh, 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 Gabriel breathed, rushing to the crib. She scooped Matteo up, pressing his warm, tiny face into her shoulder to muffle his cries. She grabbed Leo with her other arm, the sleeping infant heavy and fragile against her chest. Heavy footsteps pounded on the second-floor landing. The intruders were moving up. "Where are the kids?" a gravelly voice barked. "Silas wants the bloodline ended. Find them!" Gabriel's blood ran cold. She couldn't take the stairs. They would hear her. She scanned the nursery. The walk-in closet? No, the first place they'd look. Under the crib? Too exposed. Her eyes landed on the antique laundry chute in the corner of the adjoining bathroom. It was a relic from when the house was built in the 1920s, leading straight down into a reinforced concrete collection bin in the sub-basement. It was narrow, designed for linens, not people. Gabriel didn't think. She moved. She carried the boys into the bathroom, quietly locking the door behind her. She opened the heavy brass door of the chute. The darkness below was absolute. She heard the nursery door kick open. Wood splintered. "Clear!" a voice shouted. "Cribs are empty!" Gabriel climbed into the chute, her body contorting awkwardly. She kept the twins pinned securely to her chest, whispering desperate, silent prayers. She hooked her elbows against the sides of the metal shaft to slow her descent. It was agonizing. The metal dug into her skin, scraping her arms raw through her thin uniform, but she gritted her teeth and lowered herself down, inch by terrifying inch, into the pitch black of the sub-basement. Minutes later, she heard the bathroom door get kicked in above her. The intruders were furious. They tore the room apart, completely ignoring the small brass door of the chute. Down in the dark, cold concrete bin, Gabriel sat shivering for hours. She wrapped the boys in her uniform apron to keep them warm. Every time Matteo whimpered, she rocked him, humming a tuneless, breathless lullaby. She smelled of blood from her scraped arms, sweat, and fear. It wasn't until the first light of dawn crept through a tiny ventilation grate that she heard the heavy, commanding sound of a helicopter landing on the estate lawn. Then the frantic, terrifying roar of Griffin Russo. "Where are they?" Griffin's voice boomed, echoing through the floorboards above. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated devastation. "Where is my wife? Where are my sons?" Gabriel waited until she heard the familiar voice of Arturo, the underboss, before she began to kick against the metal door of the collection bin. 10 minutes later, the heavy steel door was wrenched open. The beam of a tactical flashlight hit Gabriel, blinding her. "Boss!" Arturo yelled, his voice cracking. "Down here!" Griffin Russo shoved his men aside. He looked like a nightmare. His bespoke charcoal suit was rumpled, his tie gone, his dark hair disheveled. The icy, calculated demeanor of Chicago's most feared man was gone, replaced by the frantic energy of a wounded predator. He stared into the concrete bin. There, covered in dust, blood and grime, sat his 22-year-old maid. Her uniform was torn. Her arms were bruised and bleeding. And in her lap, completely unharmed and sleeping soundly, were the sole heirs to the Russo Empire. Griffin fell to his knees on the dusty concrete. He didn't speak. He reached out with trembling, blood-stained hands and touched Leo's cheek, then Matteo's. Finally, his dark, piercing eyes locked onto Gabriel's. "Sylvia," Griffin choked out, looking around the basement for his wife. "She left, sir," Gabriel whispered, her voice hoarse, before they came upstairs. She took the elevator. A deadly, terrifying silence settled over Griffin. The relief in his eyes hardened into something sharp, violent, and absolute. He looked back down at the maid who had bled to protect what his own wife had abandoned. "Get her up," Griffin commanded Arturo, his voice dropping to a low, lethal timbre. He carefully lifted his sons from Gabriel's arms. "And someone call the doctor for Miss Hayes. She's coming with us." The transition from the blood-soaked manor to the sky-high fortress of the Russo Enterprises tower happened in a blur. Gabriel found herself in the penthouse, a sprawling, multi-million-dollar expanse of floor-to-ceiling glass, black marble, and state-of-the-art security. For the first 48 hours, she was treated by Griffin's private physician. Her scraped arms were bandaged. She was given a mild sedative, and she slept in a guest bedroom that was larger than her entire apartment in Pilsen. When she finally woke with a clear head, she found a wardrobe filled with silk loungewear, cashmere sweaters, and designer dresses in her exact size. Her cheap maid's uniform was gone, burned along with the nightmare of that night. She dressed in a simple beige cashmere sweater and soft pants, feeling like an imposter in her own skin. She navigated the quiet, cavernous hallways of the penthouse until she found the living room. Griffin was standing by the glass walls, looking out over the Chicago skyline. He held a crystal tumbler of amber liquid. He hadn't slept. The dark circles under his eyes and the shadow of stubble on his jaw betrayed him. "Mr. Russo," Gabriel said softly, stopping a respectful 10 feet away. He turned. His gaze swept over her, taking in the bandages on her arms and the color returning to her cheeks. The intensity in his dark eyes made her breath hitch. It wasn't the look of an employer assessing a servant. It was heavy, possessive. "Sit, Gabriel," he said, gesturing to the white leather sofa. She sat, her hands folded nervously in her lap. "Are the boys okay?" "They are sleeping. Safe. Because of you." Griffin walked over and sat in the armchair opposite her. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I had Arturo pull the security footage from the estate, the internal cameras that feed to my private server." Gabriel swallowed hard. "Sylvia didn't just run," Griffin said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "She bypassed the security on the south gate exactly 4 minutes before the Moretti hit. Squad breached the perimeter. She gave them the codes." Gabriel gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She let them in?" Silas Moretti offered her $5 million, safe passage to Europe, and a guarantee she would never have to play the dutiful mafia wife again, Griffin explained, swirling the liquor in his glass. All she had to do was leave the doors unlocked and walk away. She sold my life and the lives of my sons for a vacation. The sheer coldness of the betrayal made Gabriel sick to her stomach. I'm so sorry, Mr. Russo." "Griffin," he corrected her sharply. "You will call me Griffin." He set the glass down and looked at her, truly looked at her. "You make $9 an hour. You have no family in the city. You have asthma, a pile of student debt you couldn't finish paying off because you had to drop out, and you live in a neighborhood where gunshots are a nightly lullaby." Gabriel stiffened, her cheeks burning. "You looked into my background?" "I know everything about you, Gabriel. I know you had 100 reasons to run that night, and not a single reason to stay. Yet you bled for my blood." Griffin stood up, closing the distance between them. He knelt on one knee before the sofa, bringing himself to her eye level. The sheer size of him, the power radiating off his frame, was suffocating. "I need to go home," Gabriel blurted out, sudden panic rising in her chest. "My rent is due on Friday, and my cat is at my neighbor's. Your rent has been paid for the next 10 years. Your cat was retrieved by my men yesterday and is currently asleep in the staff kitchen." Griffin's voice brooked no argument. "You are not going back to Pilsen." "I have to. I can't stay here. I'm just your maid." Griffin's hand shot out, gently but firmly grasping her chin, forcing her to look into his dark, obsidian eyes. "You are not a maid anymore, Gabriel. You are the woman who saved the Russo heirs. If you step foot outside this penthouse, Silas Moretti's men will put a bullet in your head, just out of spite. They know you ruined their hit." Gabriel's breathing grew shallow. So, I'm a prisoner. Griffin's thumb softly brushed against her cheekbone, a startlingly tender gesture from a man with so much blood on his hands. You are under my protection. Whatever you want, you name it, and it is yours. Clothes, money, cars, a private island. Just ask. But you are not leaving this tower, and you will be the sole caretaker of Matteo and Leo. I don't know how to raise children, she protested, tears of frustration spilling over. You know how to protect them, Griffin said fiercely. That is more than their own mother knew. They know your scent. They calm down when they hear your voice. You are their mother now. The absolute finality in his words struck Gabriel like a physical blow. She looked around the beautiful, sterile penthouse, the bulletproof glass, the armed guards stationed at the private elevator. She had survived the night, only to walk into a golden cage, and the man holding the key looked at her, not with gratitude, but with an obsessive, terrifying devotion. 3 weeks passed in a surreal haze of luxury and confinement. Gabriel's life settled into a bizarre routine. By day, she managed the twins. They had a nursery in the penthouse that rivaled royal chambers. She fed them, bathed them, and read to them. Despite her initial terror, she found herself falling deeply in love with the boys. Matteo had Griffin's dark, brooding eyes, while Leo had a soft, quiet demeanor that broke her heart. And then there was Griffin. The underworld boss of Chicago practically lived at the penthouse now. He conducted his illicit empire from his home office, a room filled with cigar smoke, whispered threats, and men like Arturo moving in and out like ghosts. But whenever Gabriel entered the room with the boys, the atmosphere shifted. The hardened criminals would lower their eyes respectfully. Griffin would dismiss them with a wave of his hand, entirely focused on her. His presence was a heavy blanket that smothered her. Whenever she sat on the floor playing with the twins, she could feel his eyes on her. He watched her constantly. It wasn't a sexual gaze, not entirely. It was the gaze of a dragon hoarding its most prized treasure. You look tired, Gabriel, Griffin murmured one evening, stepping into the nursery. He had stripped off his suit jacket, his white dress shirt rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and dark ink. They were fussy today. Teething, I think, Gabriel whispered, rocking Leo while Matteo slept in the crib. Griffin approached, his massive frame dwarfing her. He reached out and stroked Leo's soft hair, but his knuckles intentionally grazed the side of Gabriel's neck. A shiver violently racked her body. He noticed it, a dark smirk playing on his lips. Go rest. I will watch them, he commanded softly. I'm fine, really. It wasn't a request, Mia Cara. Gabriel surrendered, placing Leo in his crib. She retreated to her bedroom, pulling the heavy blackout curtains shut. She felt like she was losing her mind. She had everything a woman could ever want, yet she had nothing. She had no phone, no internet access without a firewall, and no contact with the outside world. The next morning, the fragile piece of the penthouse shattered. It started innocently enough. Arturo brought up the Daily Mail and packages that had been cleared by the building's intense security screening. Among the boxes of designer baby clothes Griffin insisted on ordering was a small, plain, brown box addressed simply to C. Hayes. Gabriel was in the kitchen, feeding the twins their bottles, when Arturo handed it to her. He didn't think much of it. It had passed the X-ray and bomb sniffers. Gabriel set the bottles down and used a kitchen knife to slice the tape. Inside, nestled in a bed of tissue paper, was a cheap plastic burner phone. Before she could even register what it was, the screen lit up. A text message arrived. Gabriel. It's Sylvia. I know you have my boys. Silas is keeping me prisoner until I deliver them to him. He says if I don't get the twins to him by Friday, he'll kill me, and then he'll bomb the tower and kill you all anyway. Please. There is a service elevator in the East Wing. Gabriel's heart stopped. She dropped the phone on the marble island as if it had burned her. Sylvia wasn't in Europe. She was a hostage of the Moretti family, and she was trying to use Gabriel to finish the job she started. "What is that?" The voice was like a whip cracking through the kitchen. Griffin stood in the doorway, his eyes locked on the burner phone. Arturo, who had been grabbing a coffee, froze, realizing his massive failure in security. Gabriel couldn't speak. She pointed a trembling finger at the screen. Griffin crossed the room in 3 long strides. He snatched the phone off the counter and read the message. The veins in his neck bulged, his jaw clenching so hard Gabriel thought his teeth might shatter. He didn't yell. That was the most terrifying part. He turned to Arturo, his voice a lethal, quiet hiss. "A burner phone made it into my home, into the hands of the woman protecting my children. Boss, I swear, it didn't trigger any metal alarms on the low-frequency setting. It must be completely plastic-cased. I don't care if it was made of thin air." Griffin roared, the sudden explosion of volume making the twins start crying. He hurled the phone against the brick wall, shattering it into dozens of pieces. "Lock down the building. No one gets in or out. Find out exactly which courier delivered that box and bring him to me. Now." Arturo scrambled out of the kitchen, his face pale. Griffin stood panting, his chest heaving. He looked at the shattered plastic on the floor, then at Gabriel, who was backed against the counters, clutching her chest, struggling to breathe through an incoming panic attack. Seeing her terror snapped Griffin out of his rage. In an instant, the violent mob boss vanished. He closed the distance between them, enveloping her in his massive arms, pulling her flush against his chest. "Breathe," he ordered softly, one hand burying into her hair, pressing her ear to his heartbeat. "I won't let them touch you. I swear it on my life, Gabriel." "She wants the boys," Gabriel sobbed into his shirt. "She's going to get us killed." "Sylvia is a dead woman walking," Griffin stated, his voice devoid of any emotion for his wife. "But Silas Moretti knows where you are. He knows my weak point is in this tower." He pulled back just enough to look into her tear-filled eyes. His gaze dropped to her lips for a fraction of a second before meeting her eyes again, burning with a dark, obsessive fire. "The guest wing is too exposed. The security perimeter is too wide," Griffin declared, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "Pack your things." "Where am I going?" Gabriel asked, trembling. "You aren't going anywhere," Griffin said, trailing a rough thumb over her lower lip. "But starting tonight, you and the boys sleep in my chambers, in my bed, where I can see you." Gabriel stared at him, the reality of her situation sinking in. The danger outside was closing in, but the danger inside, the all-consuming obsession of Griffin Russo, had finally trapped her completely. The master suite of the Russo Enterprises tower on West Wacker Drive wasn't just a bedroom, it was a fortress within a fortress. Behind 6-inch steel-reinforced oak doors lay 3,000 square feet of dark mahogany, slate, and bulletproof glass overlooking the Chicago River. Gabriel stood in the center of the massive room, clutching a sleeping Leo to her chest, while Mateo rested in a hastily assembled mahogany crib near the bed. Griffin's bed was a sprawling California king, dressed in midnight blue Egyptian cotton. It looked like a vast, intimidating ocean. Griffin stood by a heavy oak dresser, unstrapping a custom leather shoulder holster. He placed a matte black Beretta 92 FS on the polished wood with a heavy thud. He caught Gabriel staring at the weapon in the mirror's reflection. "Does it frighten you?" he asked, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. Everything about my life right now frightens me, Gabriel admitted, her voice barely a whisper. She gently laid Leo down next to his brother, adjusting the silk blankets. Griffin unbuttoned his crisp Tom Ford shirt, revealing a torso scarred by old violence and mapped with intricate ink. Fear is what kept you alive at the estate, Gabriel. But in this room, you have nothing to fear. Not from me. He walked toward her, the scent of expensive sandalwood and gunpowder clinging to his skin. Gabriel backed up until her spine hit the cool glass of the floor-to-ceiling window. The city lights of the magnificent mile glittered far below, a world she used to inhabit but now felt entirely cut off from. Griffin placed his hands on the glass on either side of her head, trapping her. He didn't touch her, but the heat radiating from his body was intoxicating. He looked down at her, his dark eyes tracing the delicate line of her jaw, the pulse beating frantically at her throat. "You think I'm holding you hostage?" Griffin murmured. "Aren't you?" she challenged, finding a sudden, desperate spark of bravery. "I have no phone, no access to my bank account at Chase. I can't even walk down to Rush Street for a coffee without 2 armed men following me." "I am keeping you breathing," he corrected smoothly. "Silas Moretti doesn't leave loose ends. And my wife." Griffin's jaw tightened, the mention of Sylvia turning his features to stone. "Sylvia doesn't want the boys because she loves them. She wants them for the UBS Swiss Trust Fund that unlocks the day they are placed entirely in her legal custody. A fund worth $300 million. Silas needs that money to buy out the local politicians and crush my operation." Gabriel gasped. She would sell her own babies to a mob boss for money? "She already did," Griffin stated coldly. "The burner phone in the package today. It wasn't just a message. Arturo had our tech team sweep the plastic casing. It contained a microscopic GPS transmitter and an audio bug. They were mapping the internal layout of the penthouse. They were listening to us." Panic flared in Gabriel's chest again. "They know where we sleep? They know about this room?" "They know," Griffin said, finally stepping back and breaking the suffocating proximity. He walked over to a hidden panel in the wall and keyed in a biometric code. A heavy steel door slid open, revealing a state-of-the-art panic room stocked with monitors, weapons, and emergency medical supplies. "Tomorrow night, I am hosting a charity gala in the ballroom on the 50th floor," Griffin said, his tone shifting into pure tactical ice. "Silas knows I have to attend to keep up appearances with the mayor and the governor. He thinks the penthouse will be lightly guarded. He thinks Sylvia can slip in with a strike team." Gabriel's eyes widened in horror. "You're setting a trap." "I am ending this," Griffin corrected. He turned to face her, his expression softening just a fraction. "And while I do, you and my sons will be locked in that vault. You won't hear a sound, and no one will be able to touch you." "Griffin, please," Gabriel pleaded, taking a step toward him. "Don't do this. Let's just run. You have planes, you have money." "I am a Russo," he interrupted, his voice echoing with centuries of inherited pride and violence. "We do not run from our own homes, and we punish those who betray us." He reached out, his rough thumb brushing across her trembling lower lip. "Protect my blood tomorrow night, Gabriel. Do that, and I swear to you the cage door opens. You can walk away, rich and free, if that is still what you want." He dropped his hand and walked to the bathroom, leaving Gabriel standing in the cavernous suite. She looked at the sleeping twins, her heart aching. Griffin had offered her an out. Freedom. But as she watched him walk away, a terrifying realization washed over her. She wasn't sure she wanted to leave anymore. The 50th floor ballroom was a symphony of clinking crystal, string quartets, and forced laughter. Down below, Chicago was engulfed in a torrential downpour, lightning flashing over Lake Michigan. Up in the penthouse, the silence was deafening. Gabriel sat on the floor of the master suite, pushing a soft, plush toy back and forth for Mateo. The boys were unusually quiet, sensing the heavy tension in the air. The panic room door was open, waiting for Griffin's signal to retreat inside. Arturo and 3 heavily armed guards, carrying Heckler and Koch MP5 submachine guns, were stationed outside the bedroom doors. At exactly 10:15 p.m., the lights went out. Not just the lamps. The entire electrical grid of the top 10 floors of the Russo Enterprises tower went pitch black. A second later, the dull red glow of the emergency backup generators kicked in, bathing the master suite in a bloody hue. Gabriel scooped up both babies instantly, her heart hammering against her ribs. Crack! The sound of an explosion echoed from the roof, vibrating through the floorboards. The helicopter. Silas hadn't sent his men up the elevators. They had breached the helipad. "Miss Hayes, in the vault! Now!" Arturo yelled, kicking the bedroom doors open. Gabriel ran. She darted into the steel-lined panic room, the babies clutched tightly to her chest. Arturo stood at the threshold, his face pale in the red emergency light. "Where is Griffin?" Gabriel cried out. "He's coming up from the gala. He knew they'd hit the roof. He's flanking them in the stairwell." Gunfire erupted in the hallway outside. Arturo didn't hesitate. He slammed the heavy vault door shut. Gabriel watched through the small, bulletproof glass viewing window as the heavy locking mechanisms spun into place, sealing her in. Inside the vault, the sound was completely cut off. It was terrifyingly silent. The monitors on the wall flickered to life, displaying grainy, night vision feeds of the penthouse hallways. Gabriel placed the crying twins in the reinforced crib in the corner of the vault, shushing them frantically. She turned back to the monitors, her breath fogging the cold glass. On screen 3, she saw them. 6 men in tactical gear sweeping the living room, and walking behind them, wearing a sleek black trench coat and holding a suppressed pistol, was Sylvia Russo. She looked immaculate, completely detached from the reality of the violence surrounding her. She pointed down the hallway toward the master suite. On screen 4, Gabriel watched Arturo and the guards engage the hit squad. The silent muzzle flashes lit up the monitor like a macabre strobe light. Arturo took down 2 men before taking a bullet to the shoulder and going down hard. Tears streamed down Gabriel's face. She pounded on the soundproof glass, screaming silently. Then, Griffin appeared on screen 2. He emerged from the private elevator shaft, having climbed the cables when the power cut. He was no longer the polished businessman in a tuxedo. He moved like a shadow, lethal and precise. He took down the rear guard with a brutal, silent takedown, securing a fallen rifle. Gabriel watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the man who held her captive fought a bloody war for his home. He cleared the hallway, moving closer to the master suite, but Sylvia was waiting. On the camera feed, directly outside the master suite doors, Gabriel saw Sylvia hide behind a heavy marble pillar, her gun raised, aiming directly at the doorway Griffin was about to walk through. The remaining 2 Moretti guards were distracting him with suppressing fire from the left. Sylvia was going to shoot her husband in the back. "No!" Gabriel screamed in the silent vault. "Griffin, look out!" He couldn't hear her. He was stepping into the fatal funnel, entirely focused on the mercenaries ahead of him. Gabriel didn't think. The instinct that had made her dive down a laundry chute weeks ago took over. She ran to the vault's control panel. Griffin had shown her the emergency override, a large red lever that released the pneumatic seal. She yanked it down. The vault door hissed, the heavy steel swinging outward, just as Griffin stepped into Sylvia's line of sight. The sudden, loud hiss of the pneumatic door distracted Sylvia for a fraction of a second. She flinched, her aim pulling slightly to the right just as she pulled the trigger. The bullet shattered the glass of the master suite door, missing Griffin's head by inches. Griffin spun around, his rifle raised. He locked eyes with his wife. The shock on Sylvia's face was evident, even through the dim emergency lighting. She raised her gun again, but Gabriel was faster. She had snatched Griffin's heavy Beretta 92 FS off the dresser when she ran out of the vault. With trembling hands, she aimed it through the shattered doorway and squeezed the heavy trigger. The recoil knocked Gabriel backward onto the floor, her wrist screaming in pain. A deafening crack echoed through the hallway. Sylvia gasped, the gun dropping from her hand. She looked down at her shoulder, where a blossom of dark blood was rapidly spreading across her beige silk blouse. She collapsed against the marble pillar, sliding to the floor in shock. Griffin didn't hesitate. He dispatched the last 2 distracted mercenaries with brutal efficiency. The hallway went dead silent, save for the heavy rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Griffin slowly lowered his weapon. He looked at Sylvia, bleeding on the floor, groaning in pain. Then he turned his gaze to the master suite. Gabriel was sitting on the floor, the heavy Beretta lying next to her, shaking uncontrollably. She had just shot the boss's wife. She had just stepped into the underworld. Griffin walked into the room, his boots crunching on the broken glass. He ignored the cries of his sons in the vault. He ignored the blood in his own home. He walked straight to Gabriel, dropping to his knees. He didn't speak. He reached out, his large hands gripping her face, his thumbs wiping away the tears streaming down her cheeks. The look in his eyes was no longer just obsession or possessiveness. It was absolute, terrifying worship. "You stayed," Griffin breathed, his voice thick with an emotion that shook his massive frame. "The door was open and you stayed to fight for me." Gabriel leaned into his touch, a sob escaping her lips. "I couldn't let her kill you." Griffin pulled her against his chest, burying his face in her neck, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. The blood, the betrayal, the empire. None of it mattered in that moment. The maid hadn't just saved his sons, she had saved him. And as his arms locked around her, Gabriel knew with absolute certainty that she was never, ever leaving this tower. The stench of cordite and copper hung heavy in the opulent air of the master suite. The emergency generators hummed a low, vibrating rhythm that felt like a heartbeat beneath Gabriel's bare feet. Arturo, clutching his bleeding shoulder, dragged a sobbing, wounded Sylvia by her uninjured arm into the center of the living room. He threw her roughly onto a white leather chair. Her designer silk blouse was ruined, soaked in dark crimson from where Gabriel's bullet had shattered her collarbone. Gabriel stood in the doorway of the bedroom, holding the heavy Beretta at her side. Her hands had stopped shaking. A strange, terrifying calm had settled over her. She looked at the woman who had birthed Matteo and Leo, feeling nothing but a profound, icy contempt. Griffin didn't look at his wife. He strode over to a mahogany liquor cabinet, poured 2 fingers of Lagavulin whiskey, and downed it in one swallow. When he finally turned, his eyes were devoid of anything human. He was the apex predator of the Chicago underworld, fully unleashed. "You brought mercenaries into my home," Griffin said, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried the weight of a death sentence. "You aimed a weapon at my spine. The old commission in New York, the ghosts of the Genovese, and the real Chicago outfit. They operated on rules, Sylvia. Wives and children were strictly off limits. Silas Moretti operates on greed. And you? You operate on nothing but vanity." Sylvia spat a mouthful of blood onto the pristine marble floor. She glared at Gabriel, her eyes wide with a manic, desperate energy. "You think you've won, you little street rat? You think shooting me makes you a queen?" Sylvia let out a harsh, agonizing laugh. "Silas isn't going to stop. He already has the leverage." Griffin stepped closer, his towering frame casting a long, dark shadow over his bleeding wife. "Silas has dead men on my floor and a breached contract. He has nothing." "He has the UBS trust," Sylvia sneered, clutching her bleeding shoulder. "Did you really think I'd come up here without an insurance policy, Griffin? Silas's hackers breached the Swiss servers yesterday. The $300 million is sitting in a holding account. If I don't authenticate the final transfer with my biometric retinal scan by midnight tomorrow, the money automatically redirects." Griffin's jaw tightened. "Redirects where?" "To a blind trust in the Cayman Islands controlled by the Russian Bratva." Sylvia smiled, a grotesque, bloody expression. "And attached to that money is an open bounty. $50 million for the heads of Matteo and Leo. If Silas doesn't get the money, he ensures every cartel, syndicate, and hitman from here to Moscow comes for your bloodline. You won't be able to buy enough bullets to keep those babies alive." The room went dead silent. Gabriel's breath caught in her throat. $50 million. It was an astronomical bounty. They would never be safe. Not in the tower, not on a private island, not anywhere on Earth. "You would put a hit on your own infants," Gabriel whispered, stepping fully into the room. The gun was heavy in her hand, and for a fleeting, dark second, she wanted to raise it and finish the job. "You are a monster," Sylvia sneered. "I am a realist. I never wanted to be a mother. I wanted the lifestyle. Now, Griffin, you have a choice. You let me walk out of here with the biometric key. I give Silas his money, and he calls off the bounty. You keep your little bastards and your maid. I get my freedom." Griffin looked at Gabriel. The violent, possessive fire in his eyes was warring with the cold, calculating mind of a tactician. He knew Sylvia wasn't bluffing. The digital footprint of the global underworld was real, and a dead man's switch tied to a Russian syndicate was exactly the kind of coward's play Silas Moretti would orchestrate. "Arturo," Griffin commanded, his eyes never leaving Gabriel's. "Call our contact at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the dirty one on the payroll. I want Silas Moretti's exact location triangulated within the hour, and get the estate doctor up here to patch up my wife." "Boss?" Arturo grunted, wincing as he held his own wound. "You're going to let her live?" "I need her eye to unlock the money," Griffin said coldly, finally looking down at Sylvia. "But she isn't walking out of here, and Silas isn't getting a dime." Griffin walked over to Gabriel, gently taking the Beretta from her grip. He engaged the safety and set it on the table. He reached out, his blood-stained fingers tracing the curve of her cheek. "Pack a bag," he murmured softly to her, the juxtaposition of his tenderness against the backdrop of a blood-soaked room entirely surreal. "We are moving. All of us." "Where?" Gabriel asked, her voice trembling just slightly. "To end this," Griffin replied, "Silas wants a war for the throne of Chicago. Tonight, I give it to him." The drive down the Kennedy Expressway was a blur of streaking red taillights and relentless, driving rain. Inside the soundproof cabin of the armored Cadillac Escalade, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Gabriel sat perfectly still in the plush leather seat, the heavy, waterproof Pelican briefcase resting on her trembling knees. Next to her, Griffin Russo was a terrifying portrait of lethal composure. He was meticulously loading armor-piercing rounds into a matte black magazine, the sharp, metallic clicks entirely at odds with the soft hum of the SUV's engine. They bypassed the main commercial terminals of O'Hare International Airport entirely, cutting through a high-security perimeter gate and descending into the private, ultra-exclusive sector of signature flight support. The Escalade splashed through deep puddles on the tarmac, finally coming to a halt inside the cavernous, dimly lit expanse of Hangar 4. The air inside smelled sharply of aviation fuel, wet concrete, and impending violence. Sitting in the center of the massive space was a sleek, black Gulfstream G 650ER, its engines entirely cold. This wasn't a getaway vehicle, it was a backdrop for a war. Silas Moretti was already waiting. The aging boss of the Southside Syndicate stood behind a phalanx of 10 heavily armed enforcers. They were professionals, ex-military contractors, clutching Heckler & Koch MP5 submachine guns, their faces hard and unreadable in the harsh glare of the halogen overhead lights. Silas himself looked entirely out of place for a bloodbath. He was draped in a bespoke Loro Piana Vicuña overcoat, a thick, unlit Cohiba cigar resting between his teeth, and a diamond-encrusted Patek Philippe Nautilus gleaming on his left wrist. He checked the watch with exaggerated impatience. It was 11:15 p.m., 45 minutes until the Russian Solntsevskaya Bratva's $50 million bounty on the Russo twins went live. Griffin stepped out of the Escalade first. The heavy thud of the armored door closing echoed like a gunshot through the hangar. Arturo followed, his face pale and tight with pain, his left arm in a makeshift sling, but his right hand gripping a customized M4 carbine with white-knuckled intensity. Then, Gabriel stepped out. She wore a dark, tailored trench coat over her blood-stained clothes. The heavy pelican case clutched tightly to her chest. She felt the immediate heavy weight of a dozen laser sights tracking her movement, but she forced herself to stand tall. A month ago, she had been a 22-year-old girl scrubbing the baseboards of a Lake Forest mansion for $9 an hour, terrified of her own shadow. Tonight, she held the financial trigger of the Chicago underworld in her hands. "I have to admit, Griffin," Silas's gravelly voice echoed across the 50 yards of empty concrete separating them. "I'm genuinely surprised you brought the help. I expected you to walk in here with a battalion, not a bleeding underboss and a glorified babysitter. And where is the lovely Sylvia? I assumed she'd want to be here to collect her 30 pieces of silver." Griffin didn't raise his voice, yet the lethal timbre of his tone seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards of the hangar. Sylvia had a sudden, catastrophic change of heart. "She won't be joining us. But I brought what you asked for, Silas. I have her digital signature." Silas chuckled, a dry, rasping sound that turned into a wet cough. "You think I'm a fool, Russo? The 300 million is sitting in the UBS Zurich holding account. If the biometric lock isn't released by midnight, the money bounces to my friends in Moscow, and your two little bastards get hunted to the ends of the earth. Transfer the money to my Cayman routing numbers first. Then, and only then, do I call off the dogs." Griffin took 2 slow, deliberate steps forward, his long black wool coat sweeping against the wet concrete. "No. Simultaneous execution. My girl initiates the transfer from the satellite uplink in that case. Your hacker confirms the routing, and the second it hits the wire, you wipe the dead man's switch from your server. We do this together, or we don't do it at all, and I spend the rest of my life hunting you." Silas narrowed his eyes, chewing aggressively on the end of his cigar. He studied the small, defiant woman standing securely behind Griffin's massive frame. He recognized the desperation in Griffin's rigid posture. He thought he had the ultimate leverage. "Fine," Silas barked, waving a hand to a nervous, 20-something kid sitting at a folding table behind the mercenaries, frantically typing on a specialized military-grade laptop. "The cancellation protocol is queued up. Have the girl authorize the funds. Let's get this over with." Griffin turned slightly, looking over his shoulder at Gabriel. The look in his dark, obsidian eyes was a mixture of absolute trust and terrifying devotion. He gave her a fraction of a nod. Gabriel set the heavy pelican case on the hood of the Escalade and unlatched the heavy steel clasps. Inside, resting in custom-cut foam, was a modified Panasonic Toughbook wired directly into a portable satellite uplink terminal. The screen glowed a harsh, clinical blue against her pale face. She typed in the alphanumeric decryption sequence Arturo had provided. The screen flashed, bypassing the initial firewall, before prompting, "Awaiting biometric authentication key." Earlier that evening, in the blood-soaked penthouse, Griffin's tech team had forcibly extracted the necessary retinal data from a heavily sedated, wounded Sylvia before locking her in the vault. They had bypassed the physical scanner, loading the raw biometric data directly onto a flash drive, now inserted into the Toughbook. Gabriel's finger hovered over the execute button. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked up. Across the hangar, Silas's hacker gave a thumbs up. "Do it, Gabriel," Griffin murmured softly, his voice meant only for her. Gabriel pressed enter. A progress bar appeared on the screen. Decrypting 20%, 50%, 80%. Transferring funds. "Funds are moving," Silas's hacker announced through his headset, his voice echoing in the quiet hangar. Silas Moretti smiled, a greedy, victorious, and utterly ugly grin spreading across his weathered face. He pulled the cigar from his mouth. "A pleasure doing business with you, Russo. Maybe in your next marriage, you'll learn to keep your wife on a tighter leash." "The funds are moving, Silas," Griffin said, a dark, lethal smile finally breaking his stoic expression. "But they aren't going to the Cayman Islands." Silas's smile vanished instantly. "What?" Across the hangar, the young hacker gasped, staring at his monitor in absolute horror as the screen flashed violently with red warning banners. "Boss! The routing numbers. They switched at the last microsecond. The money didn't hit our shell company." "Where did it go?" Silas roared, drawing a gold-plated revolver from his coat. Gabriel closed the pelican case with a sharp, decisive snap. She stepped out from behind the SUV, her voice ringing clear and steady over the rising panic of the mercenaries. "The money was routed directly to the United States Department of Justice, Mr. Moretti, specifically to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, and it was flagged with your personal offshore account identifiers under an anonymous tip for international terrorism funding." Silas's face drained of all color, taking on the pallor of a corpse. "We didn't just wipe your Russian bounty, Silas," Griffin explained, his voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly purr as he drew a custom Wilson Combat 1911 pistol from his shoulder holster. "We locked you out of the global banking network. The FBI and Interpol are raiding your Lakeshore Drive estate and your downtown fronts as we speak. You have no money. You have no leverage. You are entirely bankrupt, and your men are no longer getting paid." The mercenaries exchanged frantic, panicked glances. Loyalty in the underworld was rented, and the rent had just bounced. "Kill them!" Silas screamed, his voice cracking with pure hysteria. "Kill them all!" But Griffin Russo was already moving. The hangar erupted into a deafening, blinding storm of gunfire. Griffin's tactical superiority was absolute. He didn't just fire. He moved like a predator perfectly adapted to the chaos, predicting the mercenaries' lines of fire before they even pulled their triggers. Arturo, despite his injury, laid down a brutal wall of suppressing fire with the M4, pinning the center line. Gabriel dropped instantly to the cold concrete, scrambling under the heavy steel chassis of the Escalade. Bullets sparked and ricocheted off the armored plating above her, the noise so loud it threatened to shatter her eardrums. She covered her head with her hands, squeezing her eyes shut, smelling the sharp, coppery tang of fresh blood mixing with the jet fuel. It was a massacre, swift and uncompromising. The hired guns, realizing their paychecks had vanished into the federal ether, broke formation. Half of them tried to run for the hangar doors and were cut down. The other half died trying to reload. Within 90 seconds, the echoing boom of the firefight ceased. The sudden silence was heavier and more terrifying than the noise. The only sounds left were the relentless drumming of the rain on the metal roof and the wet, ragged gasps of the dying. Gabriel slowly slid out from beneath the SUV, her clothes smeared with grease and water. Silas Moretti was on his knees near the nose gear of the Gulf Stream. He was clutching a gaping, bleeding wound in his stomach, the luxurious Loro Piana coat ruined. His gold-plated revolver lay uselessly on the concrete 10 feet away. Griffin stood over him, entirely untouched by the violence. The barrel of his 1911 was smoking slightly in the cool, damp air. He looked down at the ruined boss with the detached indifference of a god looking at an insect. "You broke the oldest rule we have, Silas," Griffin whispered, pressing the hot muzzle of the pistol against the center of Moretti's forehead. "You brought the war into the nursery. You went after my sons." "Griffin, please." Silas choked on his own blood, the arrogance entirely stripped away. Griffin pulled the trigger. The sharp crack echoed once, and Silas collapsed forward onto the wet concrete, lifeless. Griffin didn't spare the body a second glance. He holstered his weapon smoothly, his broad shoulders rising and falling with heavy breaths. He turned, his dark, searching eyes scanning the smoky, blood-slicked hangar until they locked onto Gabriel. He walked through the carnage, ignoring Arturo checking the bodies, ignoring the millions of dollars of damage. He closed the distance between them and dropped to his knees right there on the wet tarmac, uncaring of the blood pooling around his designer shoes. He wrapped his massive corded arms around her waist, burying his face into her stomach, pulling her flush against him. "It's over." Griffin breathed hoarsely against her coat, the adrenaline slowly leaving his system. "The bounty is dead. The threat is gone. Matteo and Leo are safe." Gabriel sank down to her knees to meet him, her hands coming up to grip the lapels of his coat. She looked around at the bodies, the violence, the absolute destruction of a rival empire, and realized she wasn't afraid of it anymore. Because the monster who had orchestrated it all was currently kneeling before her, offering her his crown. "What happens to Sylvia?" Gabriel asked, her voice a fragile whisper in the dark hangar. "Sylvia is a ghost," Griffin stated with absolute, chilling finality, pulling back just enough to look fiercely into her eyes. "She will wake up heavily medicated in a private, maximum-security psychiatric facility in the Swiss Alps under a Jane Doe alias. No one will ever visit. No one will ever find her. She will spend the rest of her natural life staring at the snow, entirely forgotten by the world." His rough thumbs reached up, gently wiping a smudge of grease and soot from Gabriel's pale cheek. The burning, obsessive devotion in his eyes was blinding. It was a gravity she could no longer fight, a gilded cage she no longer wanted to escape. "You bled for my blood. You stood your ground when the world burned," Griffin vowed, his voice thick with raw emotion. "You are not a maid, Gabriel. You are a Russo. You are the mother of my heirs. And tomorrow, I am putting a diamond on your finger, so heavy the entire world will know exactly who the new Queen of Chicago is." Gabriel looked at the ruthless, beautiful mob boss, who was entirely at her mercy. She didn't flinch. She leaned in, her forehead resting against his, sealing her fate in the shadows of the underworld. "Take me home to our boys, Griffin," she whispered. "Always, Maya Regina," he promised, pulling her into the dark. The sprawling Russo estate in Lake Forest was rebuilt, its marble floors polished to a mirror shine, no longer bearing the stains of its violent past. Gabriel stood on the grand balcony, a 2-carat flawless diamond resting heavy on her left hand, watching 3-year-old Matteo and Leo chase a golden retriever across the manicured lawns. She was no longer the invisible maid scrubbing baseboards. She was the undisputed matriarch of the most powerful syndicate in the Midwest. Griffin stepped up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. His empire was built on blood, fear, and ruthless control. But the man who held Chicago in an iron grip was entirely tethered to the quiet, fierce woman who had saved his soul. The golden cage had vanished, replaced by a fortress they ruled together. She had saved his bloodline from the ashes of betrayal, and in return, he had given her the world, proving that sometimes the greatest power isn't inherited. It is fiercely, violently earned.